G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 2 of Background Briefing's investigation into the price of grid power.
Fuel generators, RWE, announced an annual loss of 2.8 billion euros. The company conceded that it had waited too long to invest in renewables. Its CEO now has a completely different outlook.
This is the owner of these nuclear plants and the coal-fired plants. His dream is to put solar on your rooftop, a battery in your garage and a fuel cell in your basement. And that's how he's going to deliver energy to you in the future.
Renew Economy's Giles Parkinson. The speed of Germany's transition to renewables has been criticised for being chaotic and expensive. German consumers pay the highest electricity prices in Europe. Australia doesn't have Germany's high renewables target, but it does have similarly high prices. Bruce Mountain has just completed a study comparing power prices from around the world.
It found that electricity prices paid by households in Australia are actually near the highest in the world, comparable to those in Germany, which is near the highest in the world. And essentially they have doubled over the last 5 years, which has taken us from the middle of the pack to the top of the pack.
Right, because I remember just sort of anecdotally hearing that we had some of the cheapest energy in the world. That's a bit of a general perception.
Yeah, we have very cheap ways of making electricity. We have large, old coal-fired power stations which make electricity at a very cheap cost. But the cost paid by the end user, by the household end user, is not inexpensive. It was at one time, but it's not anymore. Now it's, up there at the top.
So if Australia still has cheap coal-fired power and it has more energy than it can use, why are we paying record high prices for electricity? Federal Treasury has estimated that on average our electricity bills can be broken down like this: 9% for the carbon tax, 20% for retail and customer service, and 20% for the actual energy that you use. The remaining 51% of your bill is paying for network charges. The 4% attributed to the renewable energy target is so small, Federal Treasury doesn't even measure it.
So while many of the politicians out there are going on about carbon tax and green schemes, they're not the main game. The main game is the network.
Bruce Robertson runs a farm at Burrell Creek, west of Taree in New South Wales. Before he turned his hand to farming, he worked as a financial analyst. At the end of 2011, 2 years after network companies began investing billions of dollars into the grid, Bruce Robertson received a letter from Transgrid, the state-owned network company, saying they were planning to build a major transmission line through his farm. Transgrid said the area needed the new transmission line because of a sharp increase in local energy demand.
Well, they were telling us that they were building these power lines to cater for this massive increase in demand, and we just simply couldn't see that increase. I've been a voluntary judge of the Manning Valley Business Awards, and I had a very good idea of what was going on in our local community in the business side of things, and I couldn't see much in the way of increasing demand that they were talking about. In fact, I could actually see a fair bit going the other way.
Bruce Robertson and a group of locals decided to do their own research.
There was this amazing amount of information, but it was very complex and hard to digest. And when you got to the bottom of it, the electricity industry was saying nationally that demand was rising, when in fact demand was falling.
What are you thinking at this point?
Well, I think there was kind of like a few, if you like, light bulb moments in the campaign against Transgrid, and one of those very definitely was when we discovered the way they were paid. These electricity distribution and transmission companies that build the poles and the wires around the state and nation are paid purely based on their assets. They're not paid on the amount of electricity delivered. They're not paid on the efficiency of doing that. They're only paid on their assets. So if they build more, they get paid more. And once we'd sort of worked that out, we realised what the incentive was for them to push a power line down our valley when there's no demand, because they get paid more.
Who pays them?
We do, the electricity consumer.
What Bruce Robertson discovered was that not only were network companies allowed to pass on their costs of investing in the grid, they were also allowed to charge an extra 10 cents for every dollar they spent. That 10% rate of return was approved by the Australian Energy Regulator for a period of 5 years. It said this was necessary to cover the increased cost of borrowing brought about by the global financial crisis. But energy analyst Bruce Mountain says that the 10% allowance was too generous.
The evidence was quite clear at the time that the companies were able to continue to borrow money at considerably lower rates than the regulator allowed.
How much percentage-wise do you think was the difference, say, between the 10% that the regulator allowed and what the networks actually had to pay for their capital?
I could put a number on it and say, let's say rather than 10%, the number was 7%, but that doesn't tell the full story. The full story is in the actual profitability of the businesses, which can be established by looking at their annual reports.
The Australian Bureau of Statistics has done that, and what it found was that in the year before networks started investing in the grid, the pre-tax operating profit of the electricity industry was $5.4 billion. 2 years into the spending spree on poles and wires, in 2010-11, the industry's profit margin had increased by 67% to $9 billion. Over those 2 years, electricity prices rose by over 40%. In 2012, the Senate held an inquiry into the rising price of electricity. It was chaired by Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite.
What we found was those network businesses that earned the most profits were the ones that invested the most. So there was a perverse incentive in the system for an overinvestment in the poles and wires, and that led to dramatic profits for those businesses. But, of course, it was the consumer that paid for that cost of the additional capital.
Matt Thistlethwaite says one of the reasons network companies were able to overinvest was because there was very little scrutiny of their projections for increased energy demand. These were the projections they were using to justify their investments in the grid.
As a result, there was some evidence of investments that were being made that weren't required. We discovered a network business that had invested $30 million in a substation in Newcastle, and I actually visited the substation. It wasn't connected to the grid. The reason why it wasn't connected to the grid, when the decision was made a couple of years ago to invest in this particular piece of infrastructure, it was projected that the demand would be there, but the demand didn't eventuate. And you've got an investment in a piece of infrastructure paid for by consumers through their electricity bills that wasn't hooked up to the grid and wasn't needed. And that was an example that really hit home for me, this gold plating or overinvestment that was leading to increases in electricity prices. That was the only one that we physically viewed, but there was much evidence before the committee that investments like that were being made throughout Australia.
Matt Thistlethwaite. After months of vigorous campaigning by Bruce Robertson and his community, the New South Wales government agreed to look more closely at Transgrid's proposal in his area.
In the end, there was a whole inquiry into the energy needs of the mid-north coast, run by an ex-Macquarie banker, Robert Rowlandson, and to be honest, when that was announced, I was very sceptical about the outcome of it, but on reading his report, pretty much to a word, he backed up our key contentions. Peak demand was falling, not rising. The general demand was falling, not rising. The demand in our area was falling, not rising. And once that had been uncovered, he basically said he failed to see the justification for the large power line project that Transgrid were proposing down our valley, and the project was pulled.
That project, the Stroud to Lansdowne transmission line, was worth $160 million. So how much of the total $45 billion invested in the grid wasn't necessary? Energy analyst Bruce Mountain says the figure is substantial.
I would estimate as an aggregate across the national electricity market, perhaps at least a half of that total spend was not actually necessary, but it does vary by state.
Is it not necessary in hindsight, or were network companies arguably aware that it was not necessarily at the time that they were making these investments?
I would argue quite strongly it was not necessary at the time that they sought the expenditure, but the expenditure was not just about a disinterested pursuit of expansion of the grid to meet consumers' needs, but rather that a large proportion of it was driven by a pursuit of higher profitability.
The next 5-year period of investment in the grid will be approved later this year. The Australian Energy Regulator says the spend this time round will be far less than it was over the last 5 years, thanks largely to the reduction in demand that's followed the mass installation of solar and the decline in manufacturing. But Bruce Robertson says the damage has already been done. Consumers will be paying off the last round of investment for years to come, and for many, the costs are becoming too much to bear.
What people have got to realise in Australia now is we've reached energy poverty, and energy poverty is defined as when it's 10% of your disposable income that goes on energy. And an awful lot of our community, where I live, is at that point.
Are many people in your community investigating other options like solar?
Yes, solar is definitely becoming more prevalent, particularly for people that are building a new house now. There's a very real choice. And a lot of people are making the choice, I'm going to just have a standalone system. And there are a lot of standalone systems now in our area, and increasingly people will unplug from the grid.
Solar energy in Australia is being produced almost exclusively on rooftops. There are no large-scale solar farms connected to the national electricity market. Giles Parkinson.
Look, Australia ranks about 23, 24 in the world on large-scale solar, just behind Puerto Rico and just ahead of Mozambique and Guam. It's really quite an embarrassment because we've actually developed most of these technologies.
Just outside of Canberra, a solar farm is being built that will be the first to connect to the grid. It's being developed as part of the ACT's ambitious target of 90% renewable energy by 2020. Background Briefing met the ACT's Energy Minister, Simon Corbell, at the Royalla Solar Farm.
So we're looking down the valley here near Royalla on the Monero Highway, just south of Tuggeranong. And in front of us is the photovoltaic solar farm, which is being built by the Spanish company FRV. This will be the largest PV solar farm to become operational in Australia when it's finished later this year.
How big is it going to be in terms of megawatts by the time it's built?
This is a 20 megawatt facility. That's about enough power, the equivalent power needs of about 5,000 average Canberra homes. And it's part of our scheme to switch to 90% renewables for our city.
Well, often you hear the criticism of renewable energy is that it can't provide baseload power, and that's power that runs 24/7. Is that why Canberra's going for 90% renewables rather than 100%?
There's certainly recognition that there'll always be a component that needs to be met from other sources, but the argument with baseload power really needs to be properly understood. The issue with renewables is that it reduces demand, particularly at peak times, and it reduces the need to build more baseload power.
So how do you feel when the political debate around renewables is so centred around price, when you're going for a 90% renewable target?
It can be very frustrating. For me, it simply means we have to demonstrate how renewables are affordable and can be achieved at scale. Here in Canberra, 90% renewables, the cost of that policy is about $4 per household per week. But that's offset by about $4 per household per week due to energy efficiency schemes that are currently being deployed here in the ACT. So I think we're able to demonstrate that the cost of renewables is entirely manageable. I think what I'm most excited about is showing people that this is possible. People can't do what they can't imagine. And the opportunity here in the ACT is to demonstrate what can actually be achieved and what you can do, and that it is affordable and that it is achievable, and that if a small place like the ACT can do it, surely the rest of Australia can.
Background Briefing briefing's coordinating producer is Linda McGuinness. Research by Anna Whitfeld. Technical production by Andrei Shabanov. The executive producer is Chris Bullock. And I'm Jess Hill.
And the government-appointed panel reviewing the renewable energy target began its public hearings last week in Sydney. If you want to listen to that background briefing again, or indeed leave a comment, you can do so at the background briefing websites. Coming up next week...
There you go. So it's all a scam. They've built substations and power lines and generating plants because they were getting paid to build them, because they forecast that power demand had always gone up, therefore it was always going to go up regardless of anything else. And now they want to eliminate the solar power industry and the wind farming industry in order to safeguard their investments and their profit forecasts in their coal-fired power station and the grid. Well, the swamp wallaby can see that's a stupid bloody idea. The obvious answer is get your own storage and fill your batteries with sunlight during the day and only run the backup generator when it gets really, really, really cloudy. And if you really want a good, lovely, balanced system, add a windmill to it as well. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.